The Battle class would be the last wartime destroyer class developed by the Royal Navy, and would lay the groundwork for the later Daring class. Whilst the Royal Navy had entered the war with the Tribal and the J, K and N classes as their latest designs, the need to rapidly enlarge the destroyer flotillas had left these larger designs aside in favour of much simpler and smaller wartime emergency programme destroyers. These reverted to the tried and tested 4 single-gun arrangement of the pre-Tribal class destroyers, and had gradually shifted from the partially dual-purpose 4.7-inch to the more useful fully dual-purpose 4.5-inch gun, as it became apparent that the aerial threat to destroyers was significantly greater than had previously been thought. But the air threat kept increasing whilst the surface threat was proving somewhat more manageable, and so a new destroyer type was called for that could better address aircraft. This led to 2 designs: the Weapon class, which could be built in many of the smaller shipyards and used a smaller hull typical of the emergency war programme, whilst a similar design lesson was applied to a larger design that would be built in the more specialised and better equipped yards. These would become the Battle class. The war was only just approaching its second full year when this design was prepared. It was clear that all guns would need to be capable of full anti-aircraft work, and so the quick-firing 4.5-inch was selected over the 4.7-inch gun. In order to achieve the maximum concentration of firepower, these would be placed in twin mounts, as the larger hull would support this weight. However, fending off air assault required many smaller weapons as well, and the ship was still a destroyer, not a dedicated anti-aircraft picket, and so torpedoes and depth charges would also be needed. Thus, the main battery would be 4 guns, with the mounts fitted superfiring forward of the bridge, leaving amidships and aft free for all other weapons. 2 quad torpedo tubes took care of the anti-capital ship firepower element, and apart from depth charge equipment, this left large areas of the ship free to be festooned with numerous light and medium anti-aircraft weapons without having to worry about blast effects. Initially, this would largely consist of 20mm Oerlikons with a single 4-inch anti-aircraft gun aft for heavy anti-aircraft firepower in that sector. As these vessels would be big, slightly larger even than the Tribals, whose losses would be the first thing the new class would address, it was decided that they should also have a class name as opposed to a flotilla letter, and thus the Battle class was born, with some poor clerk being tasked to haul out the first several volumes of notable battles of the Royal Navy to start picking names. It is notable that the basic hulls were under construction even before a number of significant design decisions were actually finalised. For example, the 4.5-inch gun was not definitively selected until after the keels were laid for the first few ships, nor indeed was the choice for the 4-inch aft anti-aircraft gun. The mainly 20mm light anti-aircraft battery was also changed several times, with the eventual design emerging fitted with 40mm Bofors instead, with between 12 and 14 carried in the first, or 1942, batch. 8 of the guns were in twin Hasemeyer mounts, each with their own radar for guidance, and 4 to 6 singles depending on the ship, as after the first half dozen it was decided that it was simpler and more effective to have another couple of single 40mm guns instead of the lone 4-inch, with the first ships undertaking a replacement process for this purpose later in the war. Various radars, fire control directors and such were also fitted, including both anti-surface and anti-aircraft radar units, with the ships also fitted with stabilisers, making them much better anti-aircraft platforms than their destroyer size might otherwise suggest. The later ships in the 1942 run would have a slightly different equipment set. The Hasemeyer mounts were replaced by Stag mounts with better anti-aircraft radar and supposedly better reliability, although results in this latter department were somewhat varied. But the mounts, as a result, weighed more than double what the older units did, and this limited the number of overall guns, reducing it to 8 or 10, depending on if the 4-inch aft was still present. With the 1943 runs, there was some more changes. There were some concerns around the placement of the main battery, primarily that one good hit might take out the entirety of the 4.5-inch armament, and also that in the swirling destroyer fights that had occurred in World War II, the ship might be left in trouble if an enemy ship managed to get aft of it and stay there. This led to calls for either a third twin mount aft or the existing mounts to be distributed one forward and one aft. In the event, neither change was made, but an additional single 4.5-inch was mounted where the 4-inch had been on the first ships, with the 40mm battery staying at 8, consisting of 2 single guns, 1 general-purpose twin mount, and 2 of the heavier Stag twin mounts. As it turned out, the single 4.5-inch wasn't that useful amidships, as it had very limited firing arcs, but the American Mark 37 fire control system was also brought in to help with anti-aircraft work. The upper works of the ship were constantly being redesigned in various production runs to accommodate new and better radar sets. 2 more ships would be ordered for the Royal Australian Navy to a slightly different design with an improved 4.5-inch mounting, between 12 and 13 40mm, and 2 quintuple torpedo tubes plus anti-submarine warfare equipment. A further batch was planned for 1944, which would use the newer and faster twin mount from the Royal Australian ships to allow the single gun to go back to being more 40mm with better firing arcs, but although this batch was ordered, they would never actually be built. Finally, 2 further ships were planned with an even larger hull that did allow for the inclusion of a third twin mount aft and more spread out machinery arrangements, which lessen the chances of losing all power in a single hit. Various delays in getting some of the more technical equipment meant that the ships were quite slow in completing, and although many were mostly done by early 1944, these final bits of equipment meant that only Barfleur would actually see action, with 23 others also reaching the Royal Navy, plus the 2 Australian units. All other ships on order would be scrapped at some stage of their construction, in part because of the last 2 enlarged vessels, which led directly to the design and ordering of the last gun destroyers of the Royal Navy, the Daring class.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.